Were you listening to the mask? Okay, you didn't ask this. So we're going to start off with the trade that was technically not a trade deadline trade, but was at least trade deadline adjacent. It was a trade that happened last week, and it was Kadarius Toney, a.k.a. Young Joka, going to the Kansas City Chiefs. And so that, of course, affects Kadarius Toney. That potentially affects Skyy Moore, a.k.a. Sky Less. And also, potentially impacts the rest of the Giants. I think that the word they're trying to find is receiving core to describe that collection of bodies. Let's start with Toney himself, the man that was moved. He gets moved.
Let's start with the player most impacted. I want to talk about how this affects Patrick Mahomes.
Okay, so it moves him from the 102 in Dynasty to the 102 in Dynasty next. Yeah.
It's completely irrelevant for Patrick Mahomes.
Are you one of those Patrick Mahomes 101 people? Are you like Cooper, or do you have him as the 102?
No,
or the 103. Okay, I think I have him as the 103. I think I'd rather.
I wouldn't even hate him as the 103. Who do you have at 102 then?
I have Lamar Jackson.
Yeah, I was gonna say I might have Lamar ahead of him. I'm not sure. They'd be. It's a flip a coin. I'll take whichever one's left.
Exactly. That aside, are we gonna talk about Young Joka?
Yeah, I think we should. How do you feel? You're buying?
It's definitely like an upgrade. Obviously, I mean, like he was. 2 weeks ago, he was faking a hamstring injury, / having a hamstring injury / something associated with his hamstring. He was probably looking into record contracts rather than NFL careers. And basically, he hadn't played the entire year.
Time out, because you just said record contracts, and I saw a hilarious tweet, must have been around the time of the trade, stating that he has more songs on Spotify than he has receptions in the NFL. And I don't think there's anything more beautiful than that. Good for him. What a change for Kadarius.
I mean, it's really good that he has a side hustle going on for sure. No, so Kadarius Toney, we know the deal on Toney. Like, he did not play very much in his first year. When he did play, he earned 1 million targets, and he had a couple of games that were really impressive. He's a really great yards after the catch player. There's a lot of questions around his ability to be a real full-time wide receiver and more than just a gadget player. This year I thought he was a really fun upside bet to make coming into the year. And, he gets immediately injured in training camp, barely plays the first couple games, and then injured once again. So we basically get nothing. Certainly an upgrade. The thing with Kansas City, it's like a weird wide receiver room in that there's a ton of bodies, but none of them are super imposing. So it's something where if someone can rise to the top, you have that opportunity. I mean, I'm buying or I'm selling, really depending on what the price is. Like, I could see a kind of a vast array of how people feel from league to league. If someone wants to offer me like a mid 2, and I have the opportunity to get out of Toney, who was a mid 2 in the first place, for basically what I paid after 2 years of mostly doing nothing, like, I think you just kind of have to take that at this point. That being said, like, I'm not going to sell him for 3. I think he has a decent degree of upside. He's never been on the field and not gotten a bunch of targets, and he now goes to a really cool offense. So
I'm perplexed as to why you would want to trade him for a mid 2, because I heard today that the 2023 rookie wide receiver class is actually weak.
That's a good point.
So why would you want to trade him for a 2023 second when you're getting a weak wide receiver?
That is a good question. I mean, ultimately, what really determines the draft class is the quarterbacks and the running backs. Those are the positions. Well, quarterback really is the position of scarcity. Running back, to some extent, is a position of scarcity, or at the very least, it's a position of perceived scarcity, such that the bar for being good and having value and being able to resell them is just way lower than it is at wide receiver. So once you get past those running backs, wide receivers, I mean, that was the problem with the 22 class. I like the 22 class. The problem was that we were taking fucking wide receivers already by the 102 and the 103. In a normal class, you're taking Drake London's and Garrett Wilson's, the 1-6 and the 1-7, and then we're feeling great all the way through the rest of the first round, and we're not taking Jahan Dotson's at the 1-11, right? Sure. I think 2023 is going to be lovely because all of the wide receivers that are, as the kids say, mid, we'll be taking them at the 1-2 turn. So it's going to be fine because we're going to have a bunch of running backs.
I think there's this cycle that happens every year, and it's like a year out, there's just rainbows and butterflies everywhere, and you're like, every prospect is going to be amazing. And then in their draft year, people like start nitpicking and they're like, well, this guy's draftable, let's watch him. And they're like, oh, no. He stepped with his left foot. He stepped with his right. His hands were upside down when he caught that ball. They should have been right ways up. And they nitpick at these little plays that don't really matter. And then we end up with like this mid-season lull where we're like, I don't know, the class maybe isn't that good. And then the draft approaches and everybody falls back in love. And at the end of the day, like I just want them to produce and get draft capital. And then I'm pretty happy. All other things equal, I'm pretty happy. And we always have these guys that crop up at in the draft process that we've never even heard of that suddenly are drafted in round 2, sometimes even in round 1. And I have a hard time believing that the 2023 class has weak wide receivers. I think they have medium wide receiver in terms of like quality of depth.
Why have you already derailed the show sheet? We were talking about Kadarius Toney. Now
because
you're talking about
like, I'm going to trade him for a mid-second. And I was like, would you? Because this class sucks. And it doesn't. And anyway.
So you would trade Toney for a mid-second?
I would happily trade Toney for a mid-second.
Would you trade Toney for a late second?
Yeah, I would.
Would you trade Toney for an early third?
No, absolutely not. Because a late second may not be a late second by the time we get to the end of the season. And usually we're going to get some good prospects in the middle of a second round in a medium quality class. Right. This is a medium to high quality class across the board, like not just looking at wide receivers. So I'm pretty confident that I'm going to have a very exciting prospect in the middle of the second round. Yeah. And there's a chance that these guys fall to the late second. It happens all the time. And
I think there's a chance for this to be like a 2020 style draft where we're drafting guys like T. Higgins and Brandon Ayuk in the middle of the second round. Like that would be like those were really good, like mid-second round bets.
And Brandon
Higgins
Ayuk,
especially, but even like Ayuk and Shenault, like obviously Shenault didn't work out, but like Ayuk and Shenault were like very like reasonable bets to be making, and you could get them at like 2.7, 2.8.
And Brandon Ayuk was a nothing at this point of the season. He really didn't like rise until he went to the what's the Senior Bowl?
Senior Bowl. What did you say? What's the Senior Bowl? Yeah, it is in fact the Senior Bowl.
He left after like one practice because he was like, "I'm a first round pick. See you later." And somebody was like, "Oh yeah, he's better than N'Keal Harry at this point." And everybody's like, "What?" And then N'Keal Harry ended up obviously not being good. Yeah. So that was not really. It was kind of a bit of a backhanded compliment. Like, oh, he's better than the worst player we've ever seen. Good for him. Yeah. Anyways, I would trade Toney for a late second. I would still even feel comfortable.
What about a 24 second?
Oh yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I asked that because now I'm going to derail the show sheet. This is how these podcasts that start as an hour become not an hour. I have reached the point in time where I'm no longer trading for 23 firsts, and this somewhat applies to second. Now, I'm not saying like I'm not interested. If someone's like, I want to trade you my 23 first, like I'm not turning them away. But they're not the number one target for me anymore. I am pivoting to a part where at this point in time, the only scenario really where I'm likely getting 23 firsts is contenders that have other bad teams as first round picks that want to trade them to me. Outside of that specific scenario, in which I'm still not getting a ton of upside because they're trading that pick with now knowledge. Like now early picks are fully priced as early picks because if someone's like, I'm trading you this pick of a 2 and 6 team, they're going to make me pay for it. Like it's sick of a 2 and 6 team. Right. Yeah. And then the late first, it's like, that's cool at all. I mean, I still want late first in this 2023 class, but it's not as much upside. At this point in time, I'm mostly targeting 24 firsts because they are far cheaper. People are more willing to trade them. And that's where you have the opportunity to buy a first that the guy thinks is late and actually it ends up early. That's where I'm getting more excited. And I would apply some of that same logic to a second. Like, especially the second. Because if you're on the clock in the late first in 2021, it probably still won't be that hard to trade a late first in 2023 for a 24 first and maybe even an extra throw in. It's really hard to do that in seconds. Like people know the difference between the early second and the late second is usually good bets and totally speculative bets. So if someone's like, I'll give you a late, if someone's like, I'll give you my second and their record is like 6-2 or something, I would say I'll take your 24 second. Like I would just rather have the 24 second.
So I agree. And yeah, I think one of the easiest, simplest dynasty hacks in all the world is trade for the draft picks the furthest away that you can and just bide your time because those draft picks are going to end up way higher than the person who traded them was valuing them at, and or B, you're just going to sit on them and they're just going to keep accruing value. So it's simple. So what I'm hearing from you though is that you're pretty much out on Kadarius Toney. Like,
yeah, I'm not hold meme. I mean, I have a lot of Kadarius Toney, so maybe I should start actually trying to shop him. I decided to take the approach of trying to let people come to me just to see what would happen. I didn't want to be the guy desperately flinging around offers after he got traded to the Chiefs. I just think that makes you look kind of like a beta. But so far, people have not been knocking down my door to get my Toneys. So. So we'll see. Maybe the offers are coming in, but maybe I'll start sending some out too. I think that the main thing what you can do with a guy like Toney, if you do want to buy, and for the record, I would not be wanting to buy at this point at more than speculative prices. That being said, if he does work out because people won't take my shares, I'll still be victory lapping it. But I think what I would probably want to do is, like, if you do want Toney, you can't just be like, I'll send you this late too for Toney. Like, I would say yes, but in all honesty, if that's what you want to pay, that most people might just tell you to fuck off. And especially if you like try and send a third, they're absolutely going to tell you to fuck off. What I would do is like find the Toney manager, figure out a deal entirely separate to Kadarius Toney that you want to work out, and go back and forth with them, and then be like, okay, would you add Toney to this? And then they might say yes, because they might be like, oh, this guy that I was like getting ready to cut 2 weeks ago, I can use him to accomplish a deal that I want. Yeah, sure. I'll be willing to do that. And you might get him in a more cost-effective way than if you just like walk up to the person and be like, hi, I actually want Kadarius Toney. Knock, knock, knock on the door. That's usually not going to work. And then similarly, I think if you're selling Kadarius Toney and you're not able to just get that round 2 pick, you know, what might be a more beneficial outcome is you talk larger deal and you're going back and forth and you're like, I can't really give you a 2, but I'd give you Toney. And maybe they're like, yeah, okay, that's fine. Right. I'll just sort of ascribe that value that way.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think, like I'm basically out on Toney. I'm sure there's upside there if he ends up hitting because he's playing with Patrick Mahomes, and there's always upside with Patrick Mahomes. But what I really wanted to get out of you was that you're not buying in on Toney, which means that we're leaving a candle on for Skyy Moore.
Just a small candle. A small candle. Would you rather have Toney or Skyy straight up in Dynasty? I think that's probably, I would bet the community's pretty 50-50 on this one.
I think the community is going to be Kadarius Toney by a landslide because the Chiefs have indicated that they want Kadarius Toney, and they already had Skyy Moore, and they still felt the need to go and get Kadarius Toney. So I got to think that they have their internal preference is Kadarius Toney.
I mean, I think Skyy, well, so the way I would view it is like, I think that this would be like my favorable view of things for Skyy, but I also think that it happens to be a true view of things. I think their view on Skyy is like, honestly, I think that we ascribe too much predetermination to teams. Like, think about how you view some of your dynasty teams, right? Like, you probably view like your starters, your core pieces this year, and then your bench, you probably don't be like, I have this guy pegged for this role next year. I have this guy pegged for this role. It's like, oh, and then I have a bunch of young guys on my bench and we'll see what hits, right? Like, that's how you look at your dynasty teams. That's probably how they look at this wide receiver room now. They look at
that's what I think,
right? They look at it and they're like, we have Juju for this year. And I don't think they're going to re-sign him because think about what they did this spring, right? They were like, we're going to make a bet that we're not going to need Tyreek Hill, who's one of the best wide receivers in the football, because we have Reed and we have Mahomes. Our comparative advantage is that we have one of the best offensive schemers in the NFL. We have the best quarterback in the NFL, so we can create efficient offense without having to pay a wide receiver a bunch of money. We're just going to get guys that work in specific roles, and we're going to figure it out. And Juju has worked enough for them. They're not going to not give Tyreek Hill $25 million a year just to give Juju $15 million a year. So I think that he most likely walks. And then they're looking at like Hardman. He's at the end of his deal. You know, maybe they extend him, maybe not. MVS, he's cuttable after this year. Maybe they retain him, maybe they don't. I think that they're just looking at it and saying, like, we don't know what our wide receivers are next year. But we have Skyy Moore. We liked him. You know, maybe he's a guy next year. Maybe he's not, which is fair. He's done nothing to prove that he is a guy. And they're like, okay, Toney's an interesting player. We'll give up a third and a sixth for him, and we'll see what he can do. Maybe something, maybe nothing. Like, that's what I think. I think they're just looking at these guys, and they're like, we'll see what they can contribute. I think this year they're probably mostly going to be Juju and MVS as their main two. They're going to keep rotating in Hardman. They're going to rotate in Toney. Maybe they'll rotate in Skyy. I think he might be healthy and active, though, because he doesn't provide special teams value anymore. And then in 2023, I think it's a different situation. They're just like, well, then we have these other guys. Like, that's kind of how I view it. I don't think that they know necessarily who their guys are after this year.
Yeah, no, I that's exactly my take on it. It's like, hey, you know what? They traded for Kadarius Toney. They probably like Kadarius Toney more today. I think that's fair. I could see Kadarius Toney being active on game day and Skyy Moore being inactive on game day.
Yeah, he'll definitely be active on game day because he's going to return punts.
And then next year, though, who's the better wide receiver? That's what That's what matters. And they'll be competing on the same practice field, and we'll see. And it could be Skyy Moore, it could be Kadarius Toney, it could be somebody completely different. They might take a first round wide receiver next year. They probably should.
Yeah.
And yeah, so such is life. But Kadarius Toney right now on keep trade cut is 34.41, and Skyy Moore is 27.38. So according to the masses that are voting on these polls, Kadarius Toney is smoking.
What's a mid two on keep trade cut?
It's like 3,500. So
so he's like right on. Okay,
so
we'll see. I'd like to liquidate some Tonys then. Yeah, I would like to do that.
And Skyy Moore is more like a early third on keep trade cut. So like at an early,
I would definitely buy Skyy Moore for an early third.
I was gonna say I'm not selling him for an early third. I'm buying for a third, any third. Like this year.
Yeah, I mean it would still take to me like an early to mid second to reroll Skyy, which is not being offered outside of probably extreme circumstances. So at this point, I'm holding Skyy, and I'm probably even buying Skyy. I would send a third round pick for Skyy Moore in any circumstance. I mean, a third round pick, like I'm comfortable spending a third round pick for like a spot start running back, like if I need to in a certain spot. I'm definitely comfortable rolling the dice with Skyy.